revered and feared in their own times. They were ancient warriors who invented the boot camp, the frontal assault, state-sponsored education, and a lifestyle and aesthetic that, to this day, bears their name. They are the Spartans, and this is their story. From the 8th to the 5th centuries BC, Sparta was the envy of ancient Greece, a collection of several hundred, often combative, city-states.
Most Greeks admired the Spartans and feared them. They did not find it very comforting when a Spartan army, even a small one, arrived anywhere near their territory because of the reputation the Spartans had as soldiers.
The mere sight of the Spartan war machine sent many foes running for the hills. When battles were fought, they routinely involved small numbers and lasted only a matter of days. However, early in the 5th century BC, all that changed with a massive invasion from the east. Persia, a vast empire hungry to expand, steamrolled into Greece with a colossal army some 200,000 strong. But the Greeks, led by Sparta, gamely rose to the challenge. In 480 BC, 300 Spartan soldiers made an immortal stand at Thermopylae, inspiring a nation and tipping the balance of war. Then, 1 year later, on the fields of Plataea, the Spartans crushed the Persian infantry in one of the bloodiest days in history. General Pausanias and the legendary Spartan warriors under his command were hailed as heroes. Still, as the few surviving Persian troops limped home, the Greeks could only wonder, when would they fight again?
They hadn't destroyed Persian power. They hadn't destroyed the Persian Empire. They hadn't taken away the Persian money, the vast troops that they had. So any sensible Greek would have had to consider the possibility that there would be more trouble from the Persians.
The Greeks, who rarely agreed on anything, had created a shaky alliance to take on the Persians, one they managed to preserve under the leadership of Pausanias. But in 477 BC, Pausanias was replaced by an Athenian. Sparta was happy to step down as head of the Greek alliance and return to its role as hegemon, or leader of the Peloponnesian League, a loosely aligned confederation of city-states in southern Greece.
The Spartans seemed absolutely bound and determined to retreat from any kind of global role. They just basically seemed to see their only real future as Peloponnesian-based, as going back, running their league, and that's that.
Then there were the Messenians. Sparta had conquered Messenia some 200 years earlier and created a class of agricultural serfs called helots. But the helots outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 10 to 1, and rebellion was a way of life. Meanwhile, Sparta and Athens remained on good terms, despite a checkered past.
The number one politician in Athens was Cimon, who was friend of the Spartans beyond all belief. The Spartans trusted Cimon, therefore they didn't worry too much about the Athenians. Everything was going pretty well.
Cimon had great respect for the Spartans and their unwavering commitment to discipline and obedience. But fellow Athenian aristocrats who ruled the city did not think Sparta could be counted on if the Persians attacked again.
The perception emerged that Sparta was a great threat. Likewise, the Spartans from early on felt that Athens now threatened them, threatened their dependencies and their allies abroad.
So Athens began building its own formidable alliance, named the Delian League, after the sacred island of Delos, where the League's treasury was kept. Members included city-states to the north, most of the Aegean islands, and the city-states on the western coast of Asia Minor, formerly under Persian control. Athens demanded loyalty from its allies, and payment of a heavy tribute to supply and maintain the Navy.
The League had to compel some states who didn't want to join on the grounds that you couldn't be a free rider. We were bringing you freedom from Persia. We were preserving freedom of the seas and what could allow you to get rich. You have to contribute.
The Athenian Navy's relentless patrol of Greek waters succeeded in eliminating the Persian threat. Almost immediately, several members of the Delian League wanted out.
The Athenians and the other allies reacted the way Lincoln and the North did when the South felt that would be a good idea and said, no, you don't, and they used force to suppress those rebellions. So gradually, the Athenian Navy got stronger, the allies got weaker, and this was turning into an Athenian empire.
In fact, by 465 BC, the Athenians rivaled the Spartans in muscle and influence. With its commanding naval presence, Athens ruled the seas, while Sparta's celebrated army was unbeatable on land. Two power blocks with two very different ideologies. Sparta demanded that the city-states in the Peloponnesian League establish oligarchies, ruled by a privileged few. Delian League members were expected to embrace democracy. The two Greek giants were on a collision course for war when the unexpected happened.
There is an earthquake that erupts in Spartan territory, kills a large number of Spartans. The Helots of Messenia take advantage of this natural disaster to rise up in rebellion.
More than 1,000 Spartan men died in the earthquake, leaving only 9,000 hoplites to quell the uprising. Desperate, they turned to their friend Cimon for help. At great personal risk, he managed to convince a reluctant Athenian assembly to commit troops to Sparta.
The Athenians send down a large army, a land army, ready to help the Spartans against their Helots. The Athenians show up, and the Spartans say, gee, we've changed our minds.
And the Spartans then respond in this really extraordinary way with this terrific insult of sending that army packing, of sending them back home. And why they did this is because they were terrified and scandalized by what they saw. They saw these democratic Athenians walking around in an open and free way, and these Athenians asking, hey, how come you guys have enslaved the Helots? Don't you know you're not supposed to enslave other Greeks?
And this really is the moment in which it's pretty clear that the two sides are not going to be friendly.
The humiliating rejection by the Spartans outraged the Athenian assembly, further reducing the influence of old-line aristocrats. Cimon was made the scapegoat and ostracized from Athens for 10 years as punishment. Back in Sparta, the Messenian revolt raged on for another 2 years. Finally, in 462 BC, the Helots were contained. But more trouble was brewing to the north, where Athens continued its rapid expansionism by concluding alliances with Thessaly and Argos.
That must have terrified the Spartans. Their ancient Argive rivals are now Democrats. So the Spartans were worried in two ways about democracy. One was what it might do to their own society if that notion crept in, and two, how it might hurt their foreign relations because democracies were likely to join with democracies.
In 459 BC, Athens and Sparta finally came to blows. However, the so-called First Peloponnesian War quickly turned into nothing more than a series of raids and counter-raids on opposing allies.
Sometimes it's a hot war, and there are actually military battles that are fought. Sometimes it's a cold war, and there's simply skirmishes on both sides. It's never fought totally.
Meanwhile, leadership shifted from Cimon to a wealthy Athenian named Pericles. Pericles was born into politics, and he would be a dominant force in Athens for the next 30 years. One of Pericles' pivotal gambits was to take over the Delian League's treasury, which had been originally under the control of the allies.
In the middle of the 5th century, the Athenians moved this treasury from Delos back to Athens. And that was the crucial moment, I think, that when we saw that the Athenians were really taking charge.
Suddenly, flush with wealth, Pericles embarked on a public building program, the scale, cost, and magnificence of which had never before been seen. And so began the great flowering of Athenian culture, known as the Golden Age. In a sweeping, spare-no-expense building program, Pericles first had the long walls from the city to the port of Piraeus completed, a move designed to withstand any future siege. Athens soon became an island of invincible fortification, importing food and supplies from Crimea and Egypt, her powerful navy poised to repel any Spartan attempt to threaten supply lines.
It's a commercial centre as well as a military centre. So the Athenians had, so long as they controlled Piraeus and the access to it, they were pretty much secure from their grain supply being interrupted.
Pericles also ordered work to begin on the temple complex atop the Acropolis, destroyed 30 years earlier by the marauding Persian army.
Much of the optimism of Athenian culture in the 5th century comes from the victory over the Persians, which is the classical period of Greek culture, the period of heroic sculpture, of the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, of the comedies of Aristophanes, of the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides.
The brilliant philosophers Socrates and Plato were also products of the time. But perhaps the most spectacular achievement of all was the Parthenon, or House of the Virgin Goddess. Housed inside this magnificent marble structure was a giant ivory and gold sculpture of Athena, believed to be the divine champion of Athenian military power. If built today, the Parthenon would cost over $500 million, and it has endured as the masterpiece of Greek architecture. Under the astute leadership of Pericles, Athens became the center of intellectual and cultural life in the Aegean. A glittering city of some 60,000 citizens, it stood in stark contrast to grim Sparta, where the mounting influence of its neighbor to the northeast was cause for great alarm.
I think the Spartans, when they see Athens as a rising power, the first thing they think is kill it, swat it, destroy it. We can't have rising powers. We can't have competitors.
And so, by the middle of the 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful city-states in Greece, were on the verge of full-scale war. By 450 BC, the balance of power had shifted from Sparta to Athens, where the Golden Age blossomed in all its splendor. In Sparta, however, this display of extravagance was greeted with fear and suspicion. More and more, the Spartans were feeling threatened by Athens' growing power.
The Spartans are always very arrogant people, and for the Spartans, it's really important to be able to thrust their chest out and say, I'm number one, I'm top dog, and nobody else is top dog.
To hammer home that point, the Spartan army invaded Attica in 446 BC, and shortly after, the Athenians offered a truce. The 30 years' peace was agreed upon by both sides the next year, and with it, the First Peloponnesian War ended. Sparta was content to turn inward, much as the United States did following World War I. However, over the next 10 years, the Athenians continued to interfere with the members of the Peloponnesian League, practically baiting Sparta out of its isolationism.
Athens went all over the place, up in Macedonia and Thrace and in the Aegean islands, and crushed smaller cities and settlements that were friendly to Sparta. This was naturally perceived by the Spartans as the first but unmistakable steps of marching against Sparta itself.
The Corinthians, really one of Sparta's most important allies, are absolutely convinced that Athens intends to break the Peloponnesian League to become the imperial hegemon of the entire Aegean. But the Spartans constantly pull back. They're not eager to take on these Athenians. It's not going to be an easy war. They're clear on that. The Athenians have a navy that they can't imagine confronting. Sparta simply doesn't have an effective navy to respond with.
Building and manning a formidable navy took vast amounts of capital, and the Spartans had long rejected any form of money, believing it led to inequality at home and needless temptations from the outside.
They don't even have coinage of their own. So a fleet of 200 ships has 40,000 men apart from Marines, that is to say from hoplites who serve with the fleet. That's a lot of human beings to be fed. The Athenians have a system for raising that money in order to support the fleet. The Spartans have nothing of the sort.
And so Sparta remained defiant, refusing to be dragged into war. But the Spartans were forced to listen when the members of the Peloponnesian League called an emergency meeting in 432 BC. Many cities denounced Athens to the allies assembled at Sparta. By doing nothing, they said, the Spartans were encouraging the Athenians to commit further acts of aggression.
Therefore, discontent, distrust arose along with the sentiment that this could be settled only by war and not through peaceful negotiations.
Sparta's stated aim in ending the 30 Years' peace was to liberate Greece by restoring autonomy to Greek states subject to Athens. The Spartan strategy was simple: march on Attica and engage the Athenians in a land battle.
And so they mobilized probably the biggest single army that the Peloponnesian League has ever fielded. It may have been 50 to 60,000 men. And in late spring of 431, they march northward through the isthmus up to the Megarian plain, and they go into the plain of Attica.
This was the infamous Spartan war machine that enemies so feared, and Pericles was determined to avoid a head-to-head battle. Instead, he came up with a two-pronged strategy: offense by sea, defense by land. At sea, the Athenian navy set sail with 100 warships called triremes. Their mission? To conduct covert raids on the Peloponnesus. On land, Pericles' plan was more controversial. In fact, it was a totally unconventional approach to war.
Pericles' strategy was this. It was to avoid, at all costs, the standard way of fighting a war. A battle between hoplites of one side against hoplites of the other.
Pericles decides to evacuate the 200,000 acres of Attica and send its population of farmers with their families, perhaps over 100,000 altogether, inside the walls of Athens, and to ride out these invasions on the premise that Athens can be supplied by sea.
We've got a secure port. We've got massive walls around our city. We can import all the food we want. We can keep control of our empire.
They could do that because they could collect money from their imperial empire. They could maintain a fleet. They could rule the seas. It was all perfect.
Spartan has no tradition of siegecraft, so they're not going to be able to breach the walls of Athens. But they have this tradition of Greek warfare that you march into an enemy's sacred land. It's an affront to their masculinity, it's an affront to their sovereignty, it's an affront to their national pride. And you hack away a few olive trees, you burn a few acres of grain, and the enraged farmers in their frenzy come out to meet you on a plain, and then you wipe them out, and the issue is settled.
But the Athenians refused to budge. Instead, they remained barricaded inside the city, further protected by separate walls, including the long walls that extended nearly 5 miles to the harbor at Piraeus.
The Spartans are pretty much bamboozled by this. This isn't good. And this basically leaves the Spartans with no response. The Spartan system was based on when we move into your territory, you move out, and we chop you to ribbons.
Frustrated, the Spartans continued to pillage the fields of Attica, an area the size of Rhode Island. But Sparta was ill-equipped to resupply such a massive army. So, waiting for the Athenians to come out and fight, was simply not an option. 1 month after their arrival, the despondent troops packed up and headed for home.
The first year, Pericles seems a genius, but he didn't count on the idea that a city that was designed to house perhaps 75 to 125,000 inhabitants was ill-equipped in the summer months to house 250 or 300,000 inhabitants. It doesn't have the sewage facilities, it doesn't have the water facilities, it doesn't have the housing.
Pericles' biggest miscalculation, however, had nothing to do with sanitation or overcrowding.
Where he went wrong was in underestimating the effect on morale of being in effect cowardly. Going behind your walls, seeing the Spartans come and doing nothing. That went against the grain of the Greek code of hoplite morality.
When the Spartans marched on Attica the following summer, Pericles' strategy was clearly under fire. Yet no one could possibly have foreseen what would happen next.
Athens was hit by a terrible plague, which wiped out something like a third of the population in Athens. Think about what that would mean. Translate that into American terms. I mean, you're talking about what, 90 million people?
The deadly disease, probably brought aboard a grain ship from Egypt, turned the streets of Athens into corridors of horror. The city was littered with dying men. Young and old, rich and poor fell victim. The plague played no favorites.
The effect of the plague was to cast Athens, and consequently its army and navy, into a state of disarray.
And suddenly, the Athenian game plan doesn't look great. It also kills Athens' leader, Pericles, and suddenly the man with the plan is no longer around to pursue it.
The death of Pericles left Athens prey to hostile factions and reckless leaders. But what also died was even more profound: his extraordinary vision.
And that caused extreme problems for the Athenians because there was no obvious succession to him. He hadn't planned one, and it was a democratic city. There was no government. And the individuals who each thought they ought to be the successor had rather different views, and they lacked the authority of Pericles. So Athens was in a difficult position.
In addition to the devastating losses, the plague also inflicted enormous psychological damage on the Athenians. Their faith in the gods was rattled, their self-confidence severely shaken.
And in the aftermath of this, they sue for peace. The Spartans think they're going to win, and they turn down the peace offer, and the war goes on.
The Athenians all of a sudden have become wimps, is the way it would have looked to the Spartans. They won't come out and fight us. They've never done that before. And therefore, it's terrible for us to make peace, I think the Spartans must have said, with people who don't even have the guts to come out and fight.
It broke their back for the moment, but the Athenians are kind of like the Americans. They're tremendously resilient people.
And so, Athens assembled 250 triremes, making it the largest naval deployment of the war. Following a revolt on the island of Lesbos, they made use of this force and blocked the harbors of Mytilene. The next year, 427 BC, Athenian general Nicias led Athens to victory at Minoa. The Spartans countered with a decisive win at Plataea. And so went the Peloponnesian War, from city to port to island, all over the Aegean. Strike and counterstrike, revolt and forced submission.
And so both Athens and Sparta, in the first few years of the war, are really in pretty desperate straits. Neither of them really has a way to win this thing.
Despite their resolve, the Athenians especially felt the chilling effects of war. Their population was devastated, their land ravaged, and their treasury nearly exhausted. Still, as the campaign season of 425 approached, Athens valiantly prepared for battle. That summer at Pylos, on the western shores of Greece, the Athenians forced the unprecedented surrender of 120 Spartan equals. Shattered forever was the carefully cultivated myth. that neither force nor famine could make the Spartans give up their arms.
The Spartans were so upset at this loss of Spartan manpower, and also, by the way, nobody could believe that Spartans ever surrendered. It was inconceivable. It never happened before, so that they just wanted to wipe this whole thing out, but they also didn't want these men to be killed. It was these hostages that finally compelled the Spartans to make peace.
But on what terms? After 6 grueling years of fighting, no useful result could be claimed by either side. Sparta was unable to liberate Greece from the grip of the Athenian Empire, while Athens had failed in its quest for absolute security, the very reason Pericles risked war in the first place. The expenditure of lives, suffering, and money, it seemed, was all in vain. Eventually, an uneasy peace would be brokered, then shattered, thanks to one of history's most colorful and unpredictable characters. The humiliating surrender of the Spartans at Pylos in 425 BC completely altered the course of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, with 120 hoplites imprisoned in Athens, had no choice but to seek peace, under terms extremely favorable to Athens. For the Athenians, this was one victory to be savored.
Spartans would never have come to this, no matter what happened to them, if something like that hadn't taken place.
All Greece resounded from the shock. Spartan soldiers had laid down their weapons and surrendered.
Sparta and Athens once again came to the table, but this time the political climate favored peace.
Both sides had very powerful reasons for wanting to make peace. The Athenians had lost Amphipolis in the north, a major city, and with access to timber, trade routes, and generally that whole part of the empire was therefore slightly destabilized. The Spartans had lost a significant number of individuals, captured in 425, held prisoner as hostage in Athens.
However, peace was elusive, and hostilities began to breed again. As the two sides drifted back towards war, Sparta threatened to fortify a post in Attica. With 120 Spartan soldiers still in captivity, it was risky. But the dangerous bluff worked, and Athens agreed to terms. The articles of the treaty, called the Peace of Nicias, were meant to be binding for 50 years. The fighting stopped, and the disgraced Spartan prisoners were finally set free.
Theoretically, both sides laid down their arms, but it was kind of like a peace between Russia and the United States. It was a Cold War.
Immediately there were problems. Several of Sparta's allies refused to accept the peace treaty, including Boeotia, Megara, and Corinth.
Peace of Nicias had to be consolidated by a separate agreement between Athens and Sparta, and that was in a way its undoing, because the other allies of Sparta and some of the allies of Athens thought, what are Sparta and Athens up to? What do they know that we don't? And there were particular outstanding grievances on both sides.
Meanwhile, in Athens, a leader emerged, a man who loved to mock authority and rile the conservatives. A man who would prove to be one of the most flamboyant characters in history. His name, Alcibiades.
Something of a tremendously ambitious guy, something like a JFK plus General Patton, sort of a forerunner of Alexander the Great, in that he came from an extremely wealthy family, had tremendous ambition, great war hero, student of Socrates, etc., etc.
His father died when he was young, and he was a ward of Pericles, raised by Pericles in the great man's house. And I think that's a critical thing. You don't have to be Dr. Freud to see the influence here. For the rest of his life, he tried to be greater than Pericles, because that's the kind of personality that he had, which was mighty tough.
He is loved by men, he is loved by women. He's clearly the most charming and most exciting man of his time, and he's a chameleon.
Alcibiades was also unscrupulous and fabulously persuasive. He quickly forged alliances with some key Peloponnesian city-states, including Elis, Mantinea, and Argos. Predictably, this forced a confrontation with Sparta, and the uneasy peace of Nicias began to unravel.
Meanwhile, the Argives are putting together an independent league of democracies in the Peloponnesus who want to fight Sparta, and Athens joins them, and there's this enormously important day in the history of the Greek world, in the history of democracy that nobody knows about. It is the day of the Battle of Mantinea, which takes place in the year 418.
Located right in Sparta's backyard, Mantinea was a battle that had to be won. But the Spartans quickly found themselves outflanked by the enemy. Facing certain defeat, the Spartans broke from their patented phalanx, defying their commanding king's orders. It was a gutsy move that ran counter to everything they had been taught since childhood.
Sparta was very lucky that day because the officers who were told, you move from here to there, said, hell we will. They refused and later on were punished for it. And that allowed the Spartans to take the battle. If they had lost, I do believe that would have been the end of Sparta as the state we're talking about.
Argos immediately renounced its alliance with Athens and joined the Spartans. Remarkably, Alcibiades came out relatively unscathed, and over the next 2 years he cooked up a convoluted scheme. It was here at this podium where he laid out his plan to the assembly.
Alcibiades' plan is lunatic. He wants to eventually empty the city of Athens, get a fleet. The final tally will be 200 ships, 40,000 men will sail 800 miles away and ostensibly attack a democracy that's bigger than themselves and is an ally of Sparta.
The target was Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily, an area of rich arable farmland and vast mineral resources. Nicias was adamantly opposed to the plan, but he was no match for the charming Alcibiades.
I compared Alcibiades with Bill Clinton, and I compared Nicias with Bob Dole. That is to say, a man too cautious and too conservative, a Spartan at Athens, whereas Alcibiades was the most Athenian of the Athenians, the most bold of the bold. And he took enormous pleasure in his capacity to outwit people.
Nicias argued that it was imprudent to attack Sicily with so many troubles at home. But when the votes favored Alcibiades, Nicias was forced into a risky gamble.
He says, look, Sicily's big and strong. We need a fantastic force if we're going to do it. And so his hope is that the Athenians will be scared off at the high cost of this and they'll stop. Well, instead, some wise guy, politician pops up and says, yeah, like what?
Nicias quickly realized his ploy had backfired, but it was too late. Athens, fueled by the fiery rhetoric of Alcibiades, was consumed by a lust for war.
And they finally pass everything that he asked for. And they turn it into a monstrous expedition, which the negative bottom line is, if you lose that, you're probably finished.
Alcibiades, however, saw it as a call to brilliance. He was thinking honor and glory, not defeat. But in a city rife with envy, his every move was suspect.
Just before the grand fleet is supposed to go off, a really nasty business happens. Various statues of the god Hermes are defaced all of a sudden all over the city all at once.
So the bottom line was a kind of a McCarthyism, a siege of McCarthyism happened in Athens, where people were arrested by the hundreds. Innocent people were turning stool pigeon, turning in their friends. They did it, he did it.
Enemies of Alcibiades spread rumors that he was to blame. So Alcibiades faced the serious charge of sacrilege. Outraged, he demanded a trial without delay while his popularity was at a peak. However, his accusers conspired to postpone the arraignment. They would try Alcibiades in absentia, after the Armada set sail for Sicily. It would prove to be a decision with catastrophic consequences. In 415 BC, the Athenians prepared to launch an awesome armada of warships for the 800-mile voyage from Athens to Sicily. Under the dual command of Alcibiades and Nicias, the most costly force ever assembled was eager to conquer a land of abundant riches and eager to bring Sparta to its knees. But Alcibiades was operating under a veil of suspicion, accused of committing unspeakable acts against the god Hermes.
And so off sails a great fleet. But shortly thereafter, the Commission of Inquiry into Alcibiades and his nefarious activities turns up a guilty verdict, and an envoy is sent to recall Alcibiades to come back to Athens to face punishment.
The result of that recall is that Alcibiades has no intention of going back and placing his life in the hands of the Athenian assembly, which he knows is equal to a death sentence.
A victim of his own glory, Alcibiades chose to escape rather than face the judgment that awaited him. But only a man with the swagger of Alcibiades would dare try his next move.
He goes to Sparta. And now we have Alcibiades in Sparta. They accept him, of course, because he's a renegade Athenian who knows a lot and could be helpful to them.
And that was when everything kind of really got crazy, because Alcibiades, who had been in Athens, the supreme Athenian, dressing well, wearing his hair long, having wild symposiums, parties, things like this. Now in Sparta, immediately became more Spartan than the Spartans. He wore the simple plain cloak, he exercised, he trained at the gym, and everyone fell in love with him.
Alcibiades brought a sense of vision and audacity to the reserved Spartans. Meanwhile, at Syracuse, Nicias was in charge of an expedition he never wanted to launch in the first place.
And poor Nicias, besides not wanting to fight in Sicily and being a very conservative, cautious leader, superstitious, is also suffering from kidney stones. So he's in poor health.
Despite lackluster leadership, the vast Athenian navy simply overpowered the Sicilians. On the ground, Athenian wall builders tried to systematically cut off enemy supply lines. Syracuse, once a pleasing mix of temples and promenades, was soon in ruins, her troops a study in disorder and insubordination. With the city about to fall, Syracusan envoys were dispatched to Sparta to persuade them to help. Alcibiades convinced the reluctant Spartans they had to act at once. The Athenians, he revealed, would not rest until they ruled the West, including the Peloponnesus.
The Spartans send one man, a man named Gylippus, to put steel into the hearts of the Syracusans.
Unlike most Spartan generals, known for their cautious and conservative demeanor, Gylippus served with uncommon bravado. Gylippus set sail with only 4 ships and a small contingent of Marines, but they were a welcome sight to the outmanned Sicilians.
And so the Syracusans both get a genuine military expert, someone who really knows how to get things done, and they also get somebody that they really trust.
Immediately after Gylippus arrived in Syracuse, a counterwall was constructed to intersect the Athenian lines. Then, over the next 12 months, Gylippus refashioned the army and navy to reflect Spartan discipline and order.
And he just whipped the Sicilians into shape, just turned them into crack troops, little by little by little, instituted certain things. He instituted the common messes, and Sicilians and Spartans were Dorians. They were ethnically related, so they had certain common societal structures, and he exploited these things, and he turned them over a period of a year into crack troops, and they defeated the Athenians in an incredible battle in the great harbor of Syracuse, where the Syracusans had a wall of ships across the mouth of the harbor.
At day's end, most of the Athenian fleet was destroyed by the Spartan-led Sicilians. Casualties were massive, the sea becoming a carpet of dead and dying bodies. Faced with certain death, the surviving Athenians fled, but soon became bogged down in swampy terrain, where they were slaughtered almost to the man.
And the whole debacle will end in the Asinarius River, where the Athenians are drinking mud and blood and fighting each other to have it.
They're just cut to shreds by the Syracusan cavalry and the Syracusan land forces, infantry forces. It is a catastrophe the likes of which the Athenians have never suffered, never even imagined suffering.
In the wake of the humiliating defeat, Nicias surrendered. He was eventually executed. The 2-year siege of Sicily had indeed been a disaster.
This was different. It was not like being defeated by the Spartans on Greek territory, but rather it was being defeated away from home in a way that was visible to the entire Hellenic world, both in Greece and abroad in the many influential colonies.
However, things were very different in Sparta. Gylippus returned home to a hero's welcome, while Alcibiades tightened the noose on his former city-state. He advised Spartan commanders to establish a permanent encampment at Decelea, within sight of the walls of Athens. In 413 BC, a garrison was installed, enabling Spartan troops to conduct their scorched earth policy year-round. Athens was forced to rely mostly on imported food, but with a much reduced navy to keep its port open and free.
Everybody in the Greek world thought it was over. And there's a general uprising in the Athenian Empire as many, many states rebel.
Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, moved in for the kill. First, he encouraged the Persian governor, Tissaphernes, to fund Sparta's war effort. Then Alcibiades snatched several territories from under the control of Athens. But all the while, he was up to his old tricks, consorting with none other than the Spartan king's wife, Timea.
Alcibiades is a man who could simply never let well enough alone. He engaged in intrigues in Sparta, which won him some real enemies. Those enemies sent word to the king of Sparta, in command at the garrison at Decelea, that the king's wife was due to have a baby.
When King Agis counted up the months since he'd last seen his wife, the numbers just didn't work.
The enemies of Alcibiades immediately point the finger and say, and you know who the real father is.
I would imagine King Agis wasn't too happy about this, and Alcibiades had to kind of hot-foot it out of there, one jump ahead of the hangman.
And so now, having turned his coat and gone to Sparta, he now does it again, but he can't go to Athens. He's an outlaw in Athens with a price on his head. Any Spartan gets hold of him is going to kill him. Only one place to go, Persia.
And so the chameleon known as Alcibiades, condemned to death in both Athens and Sparta, changed colors again.
What sort of a character can go from one defecting from his own people to their archenemy, then defect to another enemy? What kind of a person can do that?
Fate, it seems, wasn't done with Alcibiades, and neither were the Spartans. The audacious general had another trick up his sleeve, a bold maneuver even by his standards. But would it work? For more than 300 years, just the sight of a wall of scarlet cloaks and bronze shields was enough to force Sparta's adversaries to simply give up and run away. What was at the heart of this great society that allows it to prevail even when vastly outnumbered? To attempt to get a glimpse into the mind of the Spartan warrior, one can turn to some of the last vestiges of Spartan society, their poetry.
The significance of Tyrtaeus' poetry to the Spartans was great because he was a powerful poet. He raised the morale of the Spartans through his poetry. He became, in a way, the voice of Sparta.
It is shocking when an old man lies on the front line, an old warrior whose head is white and beard gray, exhaling his strong soul into the dust. An abominable vision, foul to see. But in a young man, all is beautiful when he still possesses the shining flower of lovely youth. Alive, he is adored by men, desired by women, and finest to look upon when he falls dead in the forward clash. Let each man spread his legs, rooting them in the ground, bite his teeth into his lips, and hold. This was the Spartan mindset that allowed a small, vastly outnumbered Greek city-state to enslave 250,000 people, strong-arm hostile neighbors into forming powerful alliances, and defeat the million-man Persian army. Now, near the end of the 5th century BC, Sparta was embroiled in the Peloponnesian War, fighting for control of its most powerful neighbor, the Athenian Empire. And for the first time in their history, Sparta was on the ropes.
Earlier battles had created heroes and created heroic values, but the Peloponnesian War destroyed heroes and destroyed these values. Cities were besieged, hostages were slaughtered, innocent people were butchered. It was the first modern war where the old niceties were ignored.
In order for Sparta to prevail in this new kind of war, they needed a larger, more powerful navy. In order to get that navy, Sparta needed something that it had never had before: money. For funding, the fledgling Spartan fleet turned to the only power that despised Athens more than Sparta did: Persia. Persia considers an alliance, but is dissuaded by its newest tactical advisor. He is none other than Alcibiades, the same man who had been Sparta's staunchest supporter for the previous 2 years.
He's always pushing the envelope. He is always doing that which is forbidden. And he's the kind of man who likes to sort of do a little dance around his own capacity to get away with what other human beings can't get away with.
With the ear of Tissaphernes, the Persian governor of Asia Minor, Alcibiades, the legendary Athenian turned Spartan, was now on his third side of a two-sided war.
Alcibiades has persuaded Tissaphernes that really what he should do is wear out both the Spartans and the Greeks by not giving the Spartans sufficient support. Let you and him fight, was the policy. A very clever policy for Persia.
However, the Spartans were able to collect funds from various interested governments and individuals in order to build their new navy. Meanwhile, Alcibiades continued to display some loyalty to Athens, and as a result was no longer trusted by Tissaphernes. Fearing arrest, Alcibiades left Persia, but only to rekindle his influence in Greece.
Alcibiades is staggeringly talented. He is a man who has got a brilliant education. He is charismatic. He's spectacularly wealthy. Everything he touches turns to gold, or at least for a while. Alcibiades
turned his charismatic touch once again to Athens, the same country from which he had been expelled 4 years before. In 411 BC, a handful of still loyal supporters appointed him once again as Athens' supreme military commander.
Aristophanes in the Frogs has a line that I translate this way about Alcibiades: they love him, they hate him, they cannot do without him.
And in the beginning of his now second time in power, Alcibiades seemed to be leading Athens to victory. Although Sparta now had a superior fleet, Athens tenaciously held on to its empire.
They just beat the Spartans time after time after time.
In fact, the Spartans didn't win a battle until Notium in 407 BC, when Sparta, under the leadership of Admiral Lysander, destroyed a great number of Athenian ships. But the real significance of the Battle of Notium is that it destroyed something more precious: Alcibiades' alliance with Athens.
Alcibiades is in command of the fleet at Notium, and for reasons that we simply don't know. He leaves the fleet in the hands not of another elected general, but of his own personal ship's steersman. That steersman gets tricked into giving battle to Lysander against Alcibiades' specific orders. The Athenians are defeated and almost finished off. So after that, Alcibiades can never come back to Athens again.
In 405 BC, Sparta was poised to decimate what remained of the once great Athenian navy. Lysander planned a final assault on the Athenian forces at Aigos Potamoi. In exile, Alcibiades learned of Lysander's plan and went to the front lines to warn his former Athenian friends.
When he was deposed, the Athenians went into the toilet, and then finally at the last gasp, he came back with the advice that would have saved them, which they ignored.
They refused to listen to him. We don't, after all, Alcibiades, you're not a terribly trustworthy character, which he was not. He was right in this case, however. The Athenians lose.
Alcibiades' luck had finally run out. The Athenian loss sent him into hiding, and in the process he was robbed of most of his money.
Alcibiades goes on to die rather ignominiously, probably as part of another love affair gone wrong, and is killed by irritable relatives of the girl.
He took enormous pleasure in his capacity to outwit people. And he outwitted himself in the end. But along the way, the path that he followed is simply extraordinary. I mean, there really is no other figure in Greek history who is quite as colorful and as interesting. And of course, in the end, it's fatal to him.
After their defeat at Aegispotamoi, the people of Athens hid behind the walled city of Piraeus, and Lysander built a navy blockade across the entrance to the city's harbor.
The Athenians have lost their last fleet. They have lost the capacity to resupply the city. It's really only a matter of how many months can they hold out before they starve.
Athens fell in March of 404 BC. Lysander entered the city and took control of its government and its people. The 27-year Peloponnesian War was over.
People in Athens were petrified that the same thing that they had done to other cities during the course of the war, killing all the men, enslaving all the women and children, was about to be done to them.
There certainly was pressure from Thebes and Corinth, Sparta's most powerful allies, to burn Athens to the ground and enslave its population. But Sparta ultimately chose a different fate for Athens.
What was most significant about the way the Peloponnesian War ended is not that the Spartans, rather than the Athenians, won. It's that the Spartans chose not to destroy Athens. There were certainly people in Sparta who wanted to, and there were many Athenians who expected that this would happen.
Sparing Athens, however, was not done out of mercy, but out of political necessity.
The allies of Sparta really wanted the Athenians dead. But Lysander and the Spartans realized that by destroying Athens, they would create a power vacuum that would be filled by Thebes, with which the Spartans were already having trouble.
For Sparta, the question would be, if we don't destroy Athens, what will we do with it? The beginning of a new era in foreign policy will actually be the beginning of the end for Sparta. It was 404 BC. The 27-year-long Peloponnesian War was over, and so was the golden age of Athens.
The results of the Peloponnesian War is that an entire generation has learned nothing other than war. There's a whole generation who have not been able to invest their creative talent in architecture, literature, town planning. And so we see the great buildings on the Acropolis that are not finished. We see the gradual demise of great tragedy, and the great historians will be gone.
The Athenians also saw that Sparta was in control of their once great empire.
They take away the navy. They insist on breaking down places in the wall so that they're not defensible. There's no empire, there's no money, there's no fleet. They must become members of the Spartan alliance. They swear to have the same friends and enemies as the Spartans and follow them where they lead.
A new government was installed in Athens to essentially remake the democratic city-state into a mini Sparta.
Sparta made it its business to replace democracy everywhere it could with oligarchy. The Spartans thought that democratic regimes were too warlike, inspired too much popular enthusiasm, too disorderly, and too exposed to foreign ideas.
The terms of the peace that Sparta imposed upon Athens were that they should establish an oligarchic government, overseen by 30 pro-Spartan Athenians, and it came to be known as the 30 Tyrants.
The takeover of Athens was Sparta's first attempt at nation building, and it was a dismal failure. Under the direction of Lysander, who was a far better admiral than diplomat, the so-called 30 Tyrants began a terror campaign against anti-Spartan forces inside Athens.
And they do terrible things. I mean, this is the worst internal civil war that Athens ever has. They kill something like 1,500 Athenians. It's an amazing number when you realize that the number of Athenian male adult members of the citizen class at that time might be around 25,000 people.
It was so bloodthirsty that the Athenian democratic exiles who marched back into Athens to retake their city had the support of the king of Sparta.
King Pausanias, who is now one of the kings in Sparta, is a traditionalist, very opposed to Lysander, very opposed to everything that's going on. And it's not too much to say that there is a conflict between kings.
Within several months, the victory over Athens had irrevocably divided Sparta, forced the rest of the Greek world to pick sides, and led to the mass murder of everyone in the middle.
The Peloponnesian War has taught people that you either have to look toward oligarchs or democrats for your safety, but men of moderation and men who try to bridge those political and economic differences wind up dead.
It was, in every sense of the word, a Pyrrhic victory, a war in which no one wins.
Athens lost the war, and it lost its empire. Never would they be as powerful again as they had been before the Peloponnesian War. The funny thing, though, is that although Sparta won the war, it too was devastated. It's very ironic that at the very moment of their victory, the Spartans are really laying the groundwork for their own collapse.
After the installation of an oligarchy in Athens, Lysander supported the takeover of as many other city-states as possible in the former Athenian Empire. Sparta quickly sets up 10 oligarchs in each of the Athenian allied states. Instead of being liberated, the people were indoctrinated into a system that had them wondering if they had been too hasty in rejecting Athenian rule.
You want to trade the Acropolis and Athenian democracy for Spartan barley bread and the agoge. No one wants to do that. You want to trade an Athenian drachma for a piece of Spartan lead. Nobody wants to do that.
And unlike the Athenians, they weren't great orators. They weren't able to project an ideal that the other Greeks could rally around.
The new Spartan leadership needed charisma to win over their new conquests, a quality sorely lacking in Spartan culture.
The fundamental weakness of that culture is the Spartans lack imagination. That's not prized at Sparta. They lack boldness, and they are not charming. They treat the other Greeks like dogs. And they do so because they think of themselves as being a breed apart, of being something absolutely superior to others.
There's a whole series of Spartan generals and leaders who go overseas and are brutal to the very people they're in charge of winning over. And what the Greek world has done is substitute an enlightened imperial master for sort of a brutal thuggery of inept Spartan commanders.
The type of discipline that they could impose on their own troops, that was one thing. But when they started imposing it on other people, they would make sailors would have to stand with iron anchors on their shoulders all day. That kind of thing didn't go over too big. People, they weren't too popular.
And here I think we have to go back to thinking about the training of a young Spartan. After all, who outside of your unit really matters? The world is a place to be exploited for the good of people who matter, and that's exactly the way they treat the Aegean. They act simply rapaciously in a way that pretty quickly has them involved fighting some of their own allies.
A brutal, imperialistic Sparta hell-bent on taking over the Greek world was not the reason why Sparta's allies fought for 27 years in the Peloponnesian War.
Sparta is ready to step in as the next great imperial power. This is shocking to Sparta's allies. The allies of Sparta had supposed that Sparta was going to be a liberator, was going to create a free Aegean, free of the imperial state, Athens. The Spartans don't see it that way. They see basically the opportunity to take just what they want.
The first city-state to successfully rebel against Spartan hegemony was the first that fell, Athens. In 403 BC, the Athenians returned to Piraeus and led a successful revolt against the 30 tyrants of Lysander.
Aristotle wrote that there is little point in creating a culture based solely on martial valor, because there is this thing, peace, with which one has periodically to deal. The Spartans didn't understand this. They could be counted on, once they had won the war, to lose the peace. A year didn't go by in the 4th century when the Spartans didn't manage to alienate someone who had once been their ally. They had an uncanny gift for this.
Sparta's fatal mistake in the years following the Peloponnesian War was underestimating the importance of keeping their allies happy.
No city-state in Greece, no matter how great its military prowess, could run the Greek world without the help of other allied states. They also had to worry about managing the 800-pound gorilla in their corner, Persia. Sparta had to figure out some way to keep these states as its friend. Instead, what Sparta does is alienate every last one of them. And that is a recipe for disaster.
In short order, Sparta managed to ignite the hatred of its two largest, and up until this point, loyal allies, Thebes and Corinth.
There is a breach very quickly between them and some of their allies who are too powerful just to ignore them.
Within a decade of their great victory, Sparta is again at war. And this time, the invincible Spartan war machine will be broken beyond repair. Around 398 BC, the winds of change blasted into the Spartan capital. King Agis, who had supported and defended the new imperialistic vision of Sparta, died. His brother, Agesilaus, took over the Spartan throne.
King Agesilaus, who is an out-and-out imperialist who wants to dominate Greece proper, who wants to impose governments made up of his friends wherever he can, so alienates the Greeks, and most powerfully the Thebans, as practically to awaken a new Thebes in its hatred for Sparta.
Thebes had been a long-standing and steadfast Spartan ally. Located in the region known as Boeotia, Thebes was a geographically strategic ally during the Peloponnesian War, and Sparta used Thebes to conquer Athens. But unbeknownst to Sparta, Thebes used the war to become steadily stronger and wealthier.
Any wealth that is found in the countryside is carted off by the Thebans. Furthermore, in the course of the war, the Thebans begin to feel their oats as a military power, and they are able to unite Boeotia.
The Thebans also used the waning days of the war to create a new, stronger kind of government.
While all the Peloponnesian War has been going on, there's been a miraculous revolution in Thebes, where a very conservative rural yeomanry has suddenly created a democratic society which has involved all of their population.
The thought of a democratic Thebes so close to Athens was a terrifying prospect for the Spartans. When they caught wind of what was brewing among their allies' citizenry, Sparta did what was apparently their one and only form of foreign policy.
The Spartans, rather than mollifying the Thebans and sharing power with the Thebans, go for the jugular and attempt to turn Thebes into a Spartan client, to squelch Theban democracy and to destroy Theban independence.
Sparta has these very brutal attacks on Thebes and tries to overthrow the government. There creates a backlash, and that backlash doesn't stop with anti-Spartanism. It creates a democratic groundswell, and there is created a national Theban army of 10,000 hoplites who are in physical ability, training, and strategic thinking every bit as effective as a Spartan army, and they're angry at Sparta.
The Theban army was under the command of Epaminondas, a man who was greater than anyone before him, and who would have the single greatest impact on the future of Sparta.
He was a great general who contrived tactics that had never been used before.
In the beginning, King Agesilaus of Sparta was undaunted, and he was able to keep an oligarchy in place. But with every battle that Agesilaus won, Sparta was losing something very important.
In the long run, what he ends is stripping Spartan resources, losing a substantial number of Spartan men in battle, and helping to train the Thebans in the new order of battle that would emerge in this new age. He shows some real talent. He is militarily extremely astute. He shows some real political talent. But Agesilaus doesn't seem to pay attention to the really basic notion of Spartan statecraft, and that is, don't fight the same enemy too often. Don't let them learn your tricks.
Epaminondas not only learned Sparta's tricks, he figured out how to fight back and win.
They engaged the Thebans far too many times, and they had the misfortune of dealing this time with a rising military power that was every bit as tough, but was now adopting new and very effective military tactics.
Epaminondas had another powerful weapon at his disposal: Athens. Since the ousting of the 30 tyrants in 403 BC, the Athenians had slowly but surely rebuilt their fleet, trained a new generation of citizen soldiers, and developed a stronger democracy.
It's profoundly ironic that its defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War was one of the best things that happened to Athens, if you look at it from the standpoint of democracy. Because after the bloody oligarchy that the Spartans had established, democracy in Athens was there to stay.
Athens was an important ally of Thebes throughout the first bloody decade of the 4th century BC. Thebes also built strong alliances with Argos and Corinth to form a united front against Sparta.
Now, this is the really key one, Corinth, because Corinth was the key member, the single key member of the Peloponnesian League. For it to defect and go over to the Athenian, Boeotian, Theban, and Argive axis was a really severe statement and a really severe blow.
In 379 BC, an uprising successfully removed the Spartan oligarchy from Thebes.
When the Thebans were able to overthrow this regime in 379, the new regime was dedicated more than anything else to get Sparta. And there were so many other states who now hated the Spartans for other reasons that they were able to get assistance in the doing of it.
The list of Spartan defectors grew. If a city-state didn't hate Sparta for being imperialistic, or hegemonic, or brutal, they hated them for a new reason. There was a growing sense among Sparta's few remaining allies that Spartiates won wars because they were willing to sacrifice allied troops, but not themselves.
When they had coalition warfare, they were pretty clearly going to fight on the right wing, no matter what. Now, that meant that the enemy, who also put their crack troops on their right wing, would not be facing the Spartans. And so in a series of battles, the Spartans were usually fighting the inferior troops of the enemy. And often we see this strange series of events where allies that fight among each other have more tension than the enemy across the battlefield. So if you want to get rid of some of your suspicious allies, you put them on the left wing, and the Spartans were notorious for doing that.
It was profoundly ironic that the city-state that was the most insular, the most anti-imperialistic, and the most unwilling to fight unless absolutely necessary, was now fighting all over the known world to maintain its control. It all came to a head at Leuctra, in the region of Boeotia.
Partly because they have been oppressed by the Spartans, partly because they have worked with the Spartans and learned from them, and partly because they have a remarkable generation of leaders. Talk about your greatest generation. The Thebans finally pull off the inconceivable. They defeat a Spartan army in a hoplite battle.
In 371 BC, the Spartans returned to a newly democratic Thebes for one more attempt at a takeover. They were met on a plain near Leuctra by Epaminondas, his elite 300 warriors of the Sacred Band, and a massive allied troop force. Thebes also had radically new tactics that would challenge the Spartan phalanx.
First thing that Epaminondas did was he put his best troops on the left, and that had a number of ramifications. It meant that the battle would be a head-to-head among the elite contingents. Epaminondas would not be killing Peloponnesian allies, he would be killing Spartans. He would be telling his own allies, you're not going to have to face the Spartans, we're going to face the Spartans.
The Spartan army was not only defeated, it was destroyed. More than 70% of its troops that fought in the battle were dead.
Two main reasons why Sparta loses the key battle of Leuctra. One is its inflexibility, the fact that it's unwilling to or unable to respond to innovations, for example, deepening the line, new special forces, new equipment, and so on. But the other is simply numbers.
The Spartans don't have enough men anymore. They simply don't have the 9,000 men that they had been able to fight with in the Persian Wars. They don't have the 5,000 men that they fought with in the Peloponnesian Wars. They're down to a handful of full Spartans. The ones that are left fight well, there are just not enough of them.
Epaminondas simply bowled the Spartans over. They killed 700 of them, which they could ill afford to lose, and they discredited the entire idea of Spartan military invincibility. And then most importantly, Epaminondas did not see that as the end of things, but as the beginning.
After its defeat at Leuctra, a battered and demoralized Spartan army retreated to its homeland to regroup.
It's a devastating defeat for the Spartans, but it needn't have been a death blow, and it wouldn't have been a death blow if the Spartan system had the reserves, if it had the flexibility, the resources to respond to defeat. It's an indictment of the Spartans that this is precisely what they don't have.
Sparta's greatest asset, their social and political structure, was now their greatest liability. What had been once the source of their power and stability was now the source of their weakness and inertia. In 362 BC, the Spartans were defeated again by the Thebans at the Second Battle of Mantinea.
The Spartans were so wrapped up in their old-fashioned ways that they failed to learn from experience again and again, the most astonishing instance of which is their failure to win at Mantinea when they were confronted with exactly the same tactics that had defeated them at Leuctra.
You stick your neck out. If somebody hits you, you don't do it again. You do something else. You learn from it. But Sparta did not go for innovations. It was in its character to be conservative and to retain what was there.
Not only had Sparta lost its edge in traditional hoplite battle, it was incapable of the kind of flexibility needed to meet the challenge of new forms of battle.
Warfare has evolved into naval warfare, to siege warfare, and all those require different skills than just valor or strength. They require knowledge, they require science. Once a city-state says we're going to poison your water, or we're going to fight you at night, or we're going to use slingers or archers or javelin throwers, then the Spartans' system starts to collapse.
Warfare evolved, but Sparta did not. They continued the brutal practice of exposing unwanted infants and forcing young males to the trials of the agoge.
perhaps they're being too rigorous in weeding out genetically inferior persons. By 370, we're down to as few as 1,000 adult males.
Ironically, the Spartan ideal of valor contributed to the decline. Developing a system where cowardice was a sin had left the best fighters not in Spartan regiments, but in Spartan graveyards.
Definition of cowardice would not necessarily be the one that we would use. It would not necessarily mean running away. Sometimes it meant surviving in a battle where everybody else was killed. The assumption was if you were any good, you would have been killed too.
The population decline was also the result of a Spartan birth rate that had been rapidly falling for at least a half-century.
Surely those nocturnal escape visits, visited by punishment if one were discovered, couldn't have been all that frequent, must have discouraged the opportunities for producing children, and must have contributed to the infamous decline of Spartan population over time.
If you want to have a vibrant population and you want to have women having children at 15, 16, 17, 18, which is necessary in the ancient world, given the prevalence of childhood diseases and the low survival rate of young kids, then it's a prescription for disaster.
Although there was a desperate shortfall of elite warriors, the Spartan system was conspiring to decrease their ranks even further.
Downward mobility was so easy, and upward mobility was virtually impossible. You could be demoted from the ranks for having failed to provide dinner for your messmates, for trembling in battle, from any number of other social sins. And there's really no way to come back up.
And so the Spartans developed a very dangerous sort of floating population of people who were Spartiates by birth, Spartiates by training, but had been deprived of Spartan citizenship. And so they were dishonored in a society in which honor was everything, and they would mean trouble.
That Sparta could allow this to happen, that it wasn't willing to make the ideological shift, and quite frankly, to commit the wealth to recruiting new members of the elite, is a terrible indictment of Sparta. And it bespeaks a state that was perhaps not fully in touch with reality.
And so now, for the first time in its long history, a weakened Sparta will be invaded and forced to defend itself on its own soil. Now, at its weakest point, Sparta had to face its biggest challenge. Epaminondas, the visionary Theban general, had a new vision: to redraw the map of the Peloponnese and cut off Spartan power at its source.
He was interested not just in destroying Spartan physical power, but destroying the myth of Spartan superiority, because that's really what was necessary to put the nail into the coffin. He understood that Sparta could not exist in anything like its traditional form if the Helots were freed.
They had depended completely on the agricultural labor of those Helots to keep the whole system going. Without Messenia, Sparta simply did not have the kind of resources to make it a first-class power.
With the backing of a Thebes, Athens, Corinth, Argos alliance, Epaminondas began phase one of his plan to destroy Sparta.
In early 369, he arrives in Messenia and announces that Messenians are no longer Helots, but will revert to their ancestral status as free and independent Greeks.
It's a very remarkable phenomenon, rather as if in the Old South, one day you have black slaves and the next day they are citizens of their own state.
Epaminondas and his forces remained in Messenia nearly 4 months, while the liberated Helots, perhaps 250,000 strong, built a massive wall around the new city-state of Messene.
As these Messenians, of course, were the descendants of those many generations of Helots who had made Sparta what it was at the cost of their own independence and life, they were now in the happy position of presiding over the death of the great Spartan polis.
The one thing the Spartans had been trying for centuries to prevent, the return of Messenian independence, is precisely what happens.
And while the Helots built the walls of Messene, Epaminondas instituted phase 2 of his battle plan. Allied forces fortified a strategically key city to the north in Arcadia. It was called Megalopolis, literally in Greek, the great city.
Here was another strong, powerful city, fortified in the hands of people who had every reason to fear a resurgence of Sparta.
They hem the Spartans in, and they ensure that never again can Sparta have the power that it once had. From that moment on, Sparta becomes a dinosaur.
Epaminondas was now poised for invasion. He had the Spartans cornered, and he had 70,000 troops at his disposal.
He was an absolutely brilliant man because through sheer moral authority, he created an army of retribution. First foreign army to be in the valley of Laconia in 600 years.
The famous saying that in the 600 years no Spartan woman had ever seen the smoke of the enemy's fire, that ended.
In response, Sparta did what it had never done before. It retreated and resigned itself to becoming a second-rate power in the Greek world.
The tide of history was against Sparta, the demography was against Sparta, the geography was against Sparta, and then its luck ran out when it met a man like Epaminondas.
After the liberation of Messenia in 370 BC, Sparta would never again rise to the level of power it had once enjoyed in the Greek world.
They fell from their own success. They had lived in a sort of a hothouse, hermetically sealed environment of self-reinforcing virtue, and they were not inoculated against the corruption and the temptations that they came into with success.
While other city-states now claimed the spotlight, Sparta was a shadow of its former self and became a kind of living museum. In fact, during Roman times, it was a kind of Spartan theme park, where leaders like Hadrian might have come to observe the locals and admire their now quaint ways.
The great historian Thucydides said that when future generations would look upon Athens, they would think that Athens was 10 times greater than it actually was, and that Sparta was 10 times smaller than it actually was. The Spartans had very little to parade before the world or to bequeath to posterity, because their houses were simple, their temples were simple. Once the power of Sparta dwindled, there would be very little left for people to look at. Whereas in Athens, it did not simply survive, it is there for the entire world to admire.
But the Spartans did leave behind their legacy. And even before the smoke had cleared, Athenian thinkers resurrected the nobler aspects of Spartan society in their own city-states.
They pioneer constitutional government and checks and balances. They set a precedent that the other Greeks follow.
Many Greek cities had very nasty civil wars. Spartans not. What was the secret? The ancients couldn't decide amongst themselves, as indeed we can't. Was it a democracy? Was it an oligarchy? Was it a bit of each? But something about it enabled it to persist over a very long period of time, and therefore to inspire a tradition of political theory which was very concerned with stability.
They were really thought of as a kind of an ideal of Greek civilization, of virtue, so that Socrates, Xenophon, Plato, the Republic was sort of based to a large extent on the actual polity of the Spartans. They were thought of as the way it should be.
And during the next 20 centuries, philosophers and politicians would return again and again to the glory that was once Sparta.
Sparta was idealized during the Italian Renaissance, and its oligarchic government, because of its alleged stability, was frequently put forward as a model for Venice. During the 18th century, in France in particular, people were positively in love with Sparta. Rousseau proclaimed that it was a republic of demigods, not men. During the French Revolution, many people wanted to die nobly, like Spartans.
During the American Revolution, Sparta was an inspiration to those seeking to create a stable, democratic country.
Thomas Jefferson said that he learned more from reading the history of Thucydides than from reading the local newspapers. Now, Thucydides tells the tale of how this radical democracy, Athens, lost the Peloponnesian War, and I think that's why Jefferson and the other framers of our Constitution took really Sparta more than Athens.
Our founding fathers pointed to Athenian democracy repeatedly as a horrible example of what we must not have here, which is to say true, direct democracy, unmediated by an aristocratic element that's supposed to check. And Sparta was good because everybody was public-spirited and everybody was a citizen first.
When we go to Athens today and we look at the Parthenon and we think, cradle of democracy, it was the cradle of their democracy, but not ours.
In the 20th century, however, Sparta was embraced not by emerging democracies, but by individual leaders attracted to the more nefarious aspects of Spartan society.
Nazi Germany looked to Sparta for an ideal because the teaching of Sparta was introduced into the national curriculum.
Hitler and many of his friends spoke warmly about Sparta. Hitler expressed the wish that other countries might become helots for the German warrior caste.
In a way that's very similar to both Russia and Nazi Germany. The idea that if you coerce and regiment people into particular groups and you have a strong central government that controls everybody's lives, you will have a strong military for a while. But ultimately, the contradictions of Soviet society or German society or Spartan society are manifest. And so I think it's legitimate to see the origins of totalitarianism in the Spartan society.
The lessons to be learned from Sparta continue to influence society even today.
The Spartans were the creators and the founders of what we can call Western military discipline. And that's going to be an enormous Western advantage through Greece, through Rome, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, until we see today. Western armies simply have a different idea of what constitutes discipline. You take a Western army and you pit it against an Iraqi army, an Iranian army, an indigenous tribal army, and it will usually win. And it will usually win when it's outnumbered. And so we owe that legacy of Western discipline to the Spartans.
We can learn from them that honor should be an important component of human life. A person can live without honor because material means make it possible, but a person cannot die without honor. Because when we die, there is somehow an account of our lives.
But Sparta's greatness is tempered by the fact that many people paid a terrible price for Sparta's achievements.
They had to subdue all sorts of human qualities which are necessary for a decent and properly functioning human being. It provided them with excuses for degrees of cruelty and selfishness and narrowness. The degree to which they accomplished superiority and honor at the cost of freedom, even their own freedom, is a caricature of what human flourishing requires.
It can be said that in the end, Sparta got what it deserved. Modern societies have an advantage. They have the hindsight of history to take the best that Sparta had to offer and discard the rest.